He turned and nodded at Patricia. She stood, took a deep breath as she walked to the podium, and began without pause. "Our course of treatment is unclear at this point," she said in a strong voice, "but if we can rely on the record, 4 points are manifestly clear." She opened a file. 1. We must limit access to the subject, particularly during the early stages of treatment. Until we are convinced that the subject's sudden mood changes and violent lapses are under control, only Dr. Clemente, myself, and 1 nurse and orderly per shift will be allowed in actual contact with the subject. 2. Due to the subject's very high intelligence, we must constantly question whether the subject's demeanor and actions are true reflections of the subject's actual emotional state, or merely sophisticated masks put into place to lull us into a false sense of security. You must never let your guard down around the subject. 3. A preliminary diagnosis of decompensation lability syndrome has been arrived at. Since this is a relatively rare condition, I expect you all to read up on it, but let me give you this critical reminder. Never good at public speaking. She picked a spot in the back of the room, directing her comments at a Chagall print. Although we have drastically reduced the stress that the subject is under, the erosion of the subject's personality will continue as long as the subject remains under some form of close custody, no matter how lenient that custody is or is perceived. Go the extra mile, smile, laugh at the subject's jokes if there are any, give the subject maximum encouragement constantly, but be prepared for sudden rejection or violent reaction to the most trivial of things. A hand was raised in the second row. "Dr. Nelwyn," a nurse said quietly, "just how violent is the subject? How much risk are we in?" Patricia looked over at Jack. "We'll deal with that issue in due course," he said crisply. Patricia slightly raised her eyebrows, then turned back to the audience. "Fourth, most important and apropos your question, never, under any circumstances, confront the patient over anything. Never paint the subject into a corner or limit the subject's options." She took a deep breath. "Over and above the subject's aberrant behavior reflexes and phased atavism, the subject has been trained," she looked down at Beck, "to the finest edge, to respond to confrontation with overwhelming force and violence." She paused as if unsure where to go at that point. Finally, she turned to Beck. "Before I conclude," she said softly, "it might well serve us to get the subject's history at this point." She stepped aside as Beck took the podium. "My name," he said in a steady voice, "is Brigadier General Alexander Beck, formerly SACSA to the Joint Chiefs." "What?" several people in the audience said at once. Beck smiled. "My apologies. The Special Assistant to the Chief of Staff for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities. 12 years ago, I was tasked with creating a unit of special deep penetration intelligence agents capable of operating and surviving in a hostile, urban, or unpopulated environment without the need for support or instructions." He leaned casually against the lectern. "Simply put, take a man or woman, give them a task like severely curtail Soviet agricultural output in the Ukraine, or retard Chinese nuclear facility manufacture, then turn them loose. They would have the training, ability, and survivability to go out, do their jobs for a set period of time, then be extracted, say, 6 months later." He smiled a private smile. It was the perfect concept, completely self-sufficient. They would blend with the targeted communities, take whatever they needed to live, and carry out their missions from the targeted populace themselves. Low maintenance, high yield, covert, effective human rifles, just point and shoot. The audience was stilled. A study from the Horizon Institute in Santa Monica suggested that for the types of operations we were contemplating, we seek out sociopathic personalities. It was felt that given their lack of a traditional moral base, as well as their ability to carry out complex, high-risk tasks without emotional judgments as to the relative rightness of those tasks, they would make the perfect tools. "Jesus," someone muttered. Beck fixed him with a withering stare. Unfortunately, sir, as it turned out, he paused a long time. I wasn't. Pause for a moment. Looking across the lawn at the men assembled in front of the unit, Patricia hoped that they would remember that this was a hospital and not a prison camp. Although Edel had conceded that he wouldn't use guard dogs, due primarily to the continuing German sensitivity to the image of armed, uniformed men shepherding vicious dogs. Patricia turned back to the briefing as Dr. Clemente was finishing up. In essence, Jack was saying as he reviewed the medical chart. He had just gone over. We are talking about a person who has been alone since shortly after birth, raised by a succession of foster families. The subject consistently received high grades despite being classified as a discipline problem. Graduating in the top eighth of his class, the subject turned down several academic scholarships, disappearing for 2 years until the subject enlisted in the Army. Considered an exemplary recruit with extremely high leadership qualities, the subject was recommended for officer candidate school. Shortly thereafter, the subject was court-martialed for crippling a drill instructor who he believed was being unfair to him. Prior to trial, the subject was recruited for the Deep Penetration Project. He paused and looked up from his notes. It is my personal opinion that the initial recruitment diagnosis was premature. However, the possibility cannot be discounted. He picked up a single sheet of paper. The results of his Menninger-Coleman-Forsman personality inventory are strikingly similar to that of a sociopath. He began to read from the paper. He manifests an inability to understand ethical values except on a verbal level. There exists a marked discrepancy between the subject's intelligence and the subject's conscience development. The subject is egocentrically impulsive. The subject has shown an inability to learn from previous mistakes, except, he looked up, and this exception is striking in and of itself, except by learning to exploit people and to escape punishment. He returned to the report. The subject is hedonistic, living in the present without thought to past or future. The subject is charming, likable, with a disarming manner and a clear ability to win the liking and friendship of others. The subject is, beneath that facade, cynical, unsympathetic, ungrateful, and remorseless in the subject's dealing with others. The subject has a quick ability to rationalize behaviors, often cloaking them in favorable lights such as patriotic duty. And needless to say, the subject has a most vivid imagination. He took a long drink of water, gathering his thoughts before continuing. But I must remind you, in closing, that the subject's mere act of enlisting in the military, of joining the Deep Penetration program, seems at least superficially to fly in the face of that diagnosis. He closed the file and looked out across them. Therefore, assume nothing when dealing with the subject. Observe, report, theorize. Take no chances, but ignore no possible area of inquiry. Always remember that whether or not the subject is sociopathic, the subject is unquestionably deeply disturbed. The conditions of the subject's incarceration would account for that at the very least. He paused. Questions? A young psychiatric social worker raised his hand. Couldn't the subject's enlistment and then later volunteering merely have been ways to escape presumed punishment, certainly when facing a court-martial? Jack nodded. Yes, but it must be remembered that after the subject was released on the first assignment, the subject had plenty of opportunities to escape, yet continually returned after completing those assignments admirably. He paused. An act inconsistent with sociopathy. An older nurse. Any history of violence prior to the subject's enlistment? Beck stood up. Childhood fistfights, teenage exploits with a car. At 15, an arrest for drunk and disorderly involving an altercation with an usher at a ball game, but nothing marked until the incident with the drill instructor. A psychologist. Any abnormalities in either his CAT scan or MRI? Jack shook his head. His brain appears as normal as mine. That's truly frightening, an unidentified voice from the audience said amid light laughter. A psychiatric resident. What kind of drug regime are you anticipating? From her perch by the window, Patricia chimed in, hopefully none, at least at the outset. She walked over to the lectern. It'll be a hell of a lot easier to diagnose and treat the subject if that individual does not have zonked all the time. She paused. If we have to, we'll trank the subject on an incident-by-incident basis, otherwise nothing. She sat down. Besides, the Russians noted a distinct tolerance to most light and middle-level tranks. According to their files, an elderly neurologist said under his breath, speaking of which, a psychiatrist in the first row noted, they are remarkably vague as to the details of what he was doing at the time of his arrest. Beck looked over at her. Your question? It might be of help to know what exactly the subject's assignment was and how well it was accomplished. Beck hesitated, clearly pondering some deep conflict. It was strategic in nature, he said after a time. Can you be more specific? The woman pressed. I can, but at this time I won't. Suffice it to say that the subject's mission involves slowing the Soviet industrial base to create shortages of durable and factory-produced goods. Said shortages hopefully leading to civic unrest and pressure on the communist infrastructure. How does one man do that? Someone else asked. Hypothetically, Beck's gaze was fixed, firm, resolute. Okay. In theory, a sufficient disruption in the power grid of a highly industrialized province such as Abkhaz, where most heavy industry spare parts were manufactured, would create an industrial chain reaction leading to the desired effect. He paused. With the power grid offline for a sufficiently long period of time, the supply of spare parts across the Soviet Union would, in theory, dwindle to the point of causing a near-complete industrial shutdown. Throughout, his voice remained calm, almost professorial. The entire audience stopped and looked up at Beck. There was something in the man's manner that suggested that his hypothetical example had far more substance than indicated. Abkhaz, an MD said in a far-off way. He pulled himself back from his thoughts to the problem at hand. Whatever, concerning the Russian notation about drug tolerances. His voice trailed off as he seemed momentarily distracted. Abkhaz, his voice was soft and distant. Wasn't that where that Russian reactor blew up? A nervous buzz went through the room. Yeah, someone said, a feeder reactor. It spread radiation over half of Eastern and Central Europe, not to mention Central Asia. Killed a few thousand people. When was that? Someone else asked. Beck's expression never changed. It was a graphite, not a feeder reactor, responsible for 93% of the power requirements of Abkhaz. A long pause, and it was approximately 6.5 years ago. The room was immediately silenced. All eyes bore in on Beck, whose firm jaw was set and unrevealing. Getting back to the earlier question, he said despite the stares, the subject fully accomplished the mission in all respects prior to being taken into custody. The silence persisted until a very dramatic neurologist held up his hand. General Beck, sir? Yes. No disrespect intended, sir, but there have been certain questions raised about the information we have been provided with. Beck locked eyes with the doctor, who appeared to be in his 70s, and the doctor continued in an almost gentle voice. As I say, General, I mean no disrespect, but you are the only one in this room who knows the subject, who has known him for a period of time. Now we all, he stopped and looked around the room, at least those of us who have had the misfortune to deal with the former Soviet establishment in the past, we know that often they have fabricated information against an individual suspected of espionage. You, sir, have reviewed the file, and you, sir, know the man. He paused, as if trying to figure out how best to phrase his next question. I have no wish to compromise NATO security in any way, sir, but Beck half nodded at him. Go ahead. The doctor nodded. Thank you. The file indicates several escape attempts from the penal colony, as well as a series of attacks on the guards therein, as well as a string of fatalities of Soviet military and civilian authority personnel. Even more troubling, an apparent, unprovoked attack on a civilian family, resulting in their deaths. He paused. General, can you shed any light on the veracity or prevarication of these accounts? This time even Clemente and Patricia turned and stared at Beck. He was quiet for a long time, sipping from a glass of water, head down, deep in thought. Doctor, he began with his head down. Calf, the old man said pleasantly. Dr. Calf, the Uniform Code of Military Conduct says that a soldier's first duty upon being captured is to attempt escape. Failing that, the soldier is to force the enemy to commit unusual amounts of men and material to maintain the soldier in custody. He continued, looking down as he spoke. While I cannot vouchsafe the contents of the files that were turned over to us, I can make certain safe assumptions. The subject was trained to and by nature was inclined to do everything in the subject's power to harass captors. The subject was among the best we ever trained. A short pause. When he spoke again, it was as if he was talking to himself. The subject's personal resources and instinctive ingenuity are nothing short of frightening. He raised his voice to a normal level, looking up at the doctor. Did the subject attempt to escape on at least 2 occasions? It seems reasonable. Did the subject inflict the maximum harm possible to the subject's captors in those attempts? I would have. Was there a series of attacks on the subject's guards during captivity? Probably. A sadness seemed to float slowly down his face, a furrow of his forehead, a look in his eyes, a firming of the lips. Did the subject, during one of those escape attempts, attack and kill an innocent family of 4? He paused, the sadness seeming to grow within him. I just don't know. He turned and started for the door. Something made him stop halfway there and turn around to face the somber audience. But the subject is capable of it. Beck left the hall without looking back. He moved quickly through the corridors, turning left, then right, moving randomly through the sprawling complex, not caring about where he was or where he'd end up, just knowing that he had to get out of there. After 5 minutes, he found himself at a door that led out to the rear lawn. There was work to do, he reminded himself, people that had to be briefed, procedures to be planned, systems to inspect. Then there were the countless things that were piling up from his command back in the States, the things he guaranteed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs wouldn't suffer by his absence, but they all had to wait. The priority of the moment was air. He stumbled through the door, onto the lawn. About 50 meters from the main building, he stopped and loosened his tie, unbuttoning the collar with the same hand. 5 deep, cleansing breaths later, leaning against a tree, he had pulled it all back together, for the moment, at least.